Top of the docket, tax reform. Perhaps the least enviable person in Washington, Mitch McConnell. He plans a Senate vote this week, but, and this is a pretty big but, he still doesn't have the votes. Yet, the Senate leadership projecting optimism, and they've got backup on the way. At least, they hope so. President Trump meeting this hour with members of the Senate Finance Committee. Tomorrow, the president travels up to the Capitol to rally Senate Republicans during their weekly lunch. Mr. Trump fired off this gut check earlier this morning, tweeting in part, "The tax cut bill is coming along very well. Great support." Remember, though, the president has promised over and over tax cuts would be done by Christmas. As Republican Senator Lindsey Graham puts it here, the future of the Republican Party on the line.
Failure is not an option when it comes to the Republican Party cutting taxes. To every Republican senator, the fate of the party's in our hands, as well as that of the economy.
With us this Monday to share their reporting and their insights, Michael Scher of the New York Times, Eliana Johnson from Politico, CNN's Manu Raju, and Jackie Kucinich from the Daily Beast. It's not just tax cuts. Congress is back from the Thanksgiving break. They have a very short stretch to keep the government open, come up with some spending plans, wade through some other potential issues like immigration, you know, the easy stuff. But with tax cuts first and foremost on the agenda, the political imperative is we must do something for Republicans to get one thing done this year. Obamacare repeal will not happen. Infrastructure will not happen. Is that enough when you have some significant differences still over the details?
I think it's an open question whether or not they can get tax reform through both chambers, reconcile it, the differences between the House and the Senate version. There's still some substantial differences between the two, like the state and local tax deduction, a big one. For one, how to deal with the repeal of the individual mandate, which is in the Senate bill but not the House bill. Those are just a taste of some of the key differences between the two chambers. But of course, the first big test is trying to get it out of the Senate as soon as this week. There are a handful of members who are still concerned about the deficit projections, like Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, two people who are not fans of this president. Susan Collins of Maine is almost certainly going to be a no. However, I would think that there's probably a good chance of getting at least the Senate version done because of the fact that at the end of the day, a lot of Republicans realize that this is our one chance to do something significant this Congress, and there's an opportunity to get it done.
So despite, and we can show you some pictures, at least we're going to show you 6 or 8 senators here who have voiced reservations. That's not all of them. There are more than a dozen senators who, for one reason or another, whether it's the deficit, whether it's those state and local income tax deductions, some think it's more tilted toward corporations, not toward small businesses. We went through this. It's a different issue, but it's similar to the Obamacare debate. You have legitimate philosophical policy differences among these Republican senators, and unless you've been hiding over the past 10 months, simple math, 52, which means they can lose 2, and Mike Pence can break the tie. You had some great reporting over the weekend about how, the president's meeting with Finance Committee members this hour. You would think that's a good thing. He's the leader of the Republican Party. You want to get to the finish line. But as we learned in the Obamacare debate, there's some trepidation about the president being so hands-on and involved, and his team.
Yeah, one of the persistent problems for this administration, I think, has been its salesmanship of big pieces of legislation. On the health care bill, we saw the president come out and call the House bill mean, and they've had similar problems selling this tax reform bill. Their main pitchmen for the bill have been 2 multimillionaires, Gary Cohn, the director of the National Economic Council, and Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary. And those aren't exactly the faces the administration might want, though they have selected them, for a bill that they're trying to convince voters will help middle-class Americans. The president goes in today, and he's often said unexpected things and is somewhat of an unknown. But I do think the question of whether this is really a Trumpist tax reform bill is an interesting one, and the administration really is going to have to do a hard sales job to convince senators, those senators, who are undecided, that this is a bill that will help middle-class Americans and not simply corporations, because it does cut the corporate tax rate so much.
Well, and that's really the question, is where is the sales job, right? I mean, there's an inside Washington effort that, as you talked about, the president will do over the next couple of days. But where is the big sort of effort to sell this to the country, right? I mean, there were a couple weeks, if not months ago, a couple of trips that the president made out, to sort of couple of forays into some Democratic places to think, okay, maybe we'll bring, some Democrats along. And then that sort of fizzled, and there really hasn't been much of that. Think back to some of the previous tax reform, tax change efforts that really, where you had a Republican president really trying to and succeeding in drawing 8, 10, 12 Democrats across the line. This isn't happening. The president's got a trip this week, but there's sort of an anemic effort to really say to the country, this is what I want to do, and it's sort of left to become a Washington game.
I mean, we remember President Obama barnstorming the country for Obamacare coast to coast, and we just haven't seen that from this president or this
Well, this
administration.
president isn't good at that. I mean, that's one of the problems, one of the flaws here. He has trouble staying on message. He has trouble selling something that even is in his best interest. Once he gets in front of those rallies, he doesn't really stay on task. He can give a speech, of course, but when it comes to actually going out in the country, he kind of gets wrapped up in what has been these campaign rallies, for all intents and purposes, that have been very effective for him. And he hasn't, for all of you, the talk about the president's business acumen, what a deal maker is, he hasn't really shown on any of these top line issues that he can actually seal the deal.
And so that's the big challenge this week. Again, he's having lunch with Finance Committee members today. Then he goes up to Capitol Hill tomorrow, the weekly Senate Republican luncheon. Republicans only. There is zero indication any Democrats are coming over. That was a hope if you went back weeks or months ago. They might get a couple Democrats, especially with the Obamacare mandate repeal in the Senate bill. It looks like they get zero Democrats. So they've got 2 to lose here. Nothing in Washington this year has gone the way it normally does. However, there is a rather traditional effort underway. These are from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce running radio ads against some of those Republican senators on the fence. Let's just get a little sample.
What's the best gift Senator Susan Collins can give Mainers this holiday season? The gift of tax relief. That's right. The tax reform bill could mean an extra $2,511 in the pockets of Montana families. But first, it has to become law. So call Senator Ron Johnson and ask him to support the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The time for reform is now.
To the point all of you were making earlier, we do not have the traditional White House political operation, coordination between the White House political shop and Capitol Hill in terms of the messaging, the marketing, booking the Sunday shows, getting interest groups to run TV ads. But you do have some interested parties. The Chamber of Commerce wants this bill to pass. Its corporate members would benefit if this bill does pass. Will the traditional approach work? Once this year.
Who knows? I mean, it's interesting, though, those 3 members who they're targeting.
Right.
Steve Daines is one that you would not originally anticipate someone to be a little squeamish about it, but he tweeted that he did have a conversation with Trump over the weekend. He thinks some of his concerns can be alleviated. Ron Johnson, even though he said he's opposed to the bill, I would be shocked still if he came out and voted no at the end of the day. A lot of his concerns could be alleviated by then. But, you know, even though some of these outside groups are supporting this bill, I've also been surprised with the lack of opposition from the other side on air, really going after some of these members. There just has not been as much of a concerted effort. Perhaps one reason why is that this bill has very poor numbers in the eyes of the voters. Some 20-some-odd% actually support this legislation. You have not really seen much mobilization, certainly not to the extent that the health care push was from the left earlier this year.
Yeah, I do think, you know, to that point, that Democrats are assuming 2 things. The first is that there's such a slim margin. Republicans have shown great ability to get in their own way. And the second is that the Trump administration will fumble somehow, even though there are so many things working in their favor on tax reform. But I think the Democrats are just assuming they don't have to do much to tank this bill, that Republicans have shown a great ability to you know,
do it themselves.
Yeah, well, you know, to administer self-inflicted wounds.
And part of that has been the president himself, which is why I keep coming back to the point. Will he help or hurt at this crunch week for the Senate Republicans, in that the House Republicans passed their Obamacare repeal bill, the president celebrated it and then called it mean and undermined it. That, to the point you made, Michael, I think about the populism, the new CBO, Congressional Budget Office analysis of the Senate tax plan is not good for Republicans as they're trying to make this case, in the sense that it says if you make less than $30,000 a year, you will pay more in taxes by 2019. By 2027, if you're under $75,000 a year, you will pay more in taxes, and that 13 million fewer people will have health insurance, and the deficit will go up there. So, again, we don't know what they're negotiating behind closed doors right now. That's the Senate bill as we have it now. It will not be the final bill. There will be tweaks before they vote on it.